I'm dying. And welcome to Betwixt the Books. I got COVID in January, so if you notice that I fell off the face of the earth for like a month, that's why. I'm still recovering from it. Don't get COVID. It sucks. You might be able to hear me sound a little bit sick. I'm sorry. I'm recovering from COVID. You're just gonna have to deal with it. That's where we're at right now. So we're doing content, so I'm feeling better, but yeah. Don't get COVID, guys. Today we're going to be doing a tag. We will link down below the original and all of the questions. So if you want to do it, feel free to do it. We never tag people to do these things because we're tiny and don't have friends. Or at least enough friends that read like we do to necessarily do the tags. So if you want to do it, go ahead and do it. It's down there for you. That's what it is. This one's a fantasy tag because if you aren't aware, both Gretchen and I read fantasy, although we read different genres of fantasy, so this will be interesting. We will have different answers to all of these questions. I hope you guys enjoy it. From here on out, let's go. Let's see how it goes.
So, question the first is, what is your fantasy origin story? And this basically means what was the first fantasy book you ever read? And as someone who started reading at a very young age, I don't know. But if I think about how I conceptualize myself as a fantasy reader and what books I think had the biggest impact on me as a reader, 100% hands down have to go with, getting my prop, Tamora Pierce. This is the first book in my favorite series by her, but it is not the first book I read. That would have been the Alana books. Alana is a story about a girl who disguises herself as a boy and goes for night training, and they are just amazing. Tamora Pierce was committed to strong female characters. By the time I had read her books, they were some of the only long series, connected series that were at my library in particular, and I definitely modeled most, if not all, of the fantasy that I wrote and the fantasy that I was interested in reading on stuff that she had written. Strong female women warriors, knights, jousting, questing, the whole, traditional Tolkien-esque romance fantasy style, although hers are very, very minimal on the romance, maybe a small undercurrent at the bottom, which I really enjoyed because these women had other things to do. They had worlds to save. They had things to do other than be like, who will I choose? You don't just go kill the bad guy first, okay? Love that. Also, what I also love so much about Tamora Pierce is that I feel like as I've grown as someone who understands more and more about things that are important, such as, broadening my spectrum of how sexuality works, about how the world is many other colors than white, having grown up in a small northern town that was 99% white, I feel like Tamora Pierce is also one of those authors who has grown as well and, put things in her books and listened and learned, and that is also very nice. So it's just been great. She's still one of my favorite authors ever, and I would like to say she is my fantasy origin story.
Okay, for me, I purposefully, when pulling these, was trying to pull things that were younger than young readers necessarily, because I saw a lot of people talking about Harry Potter, and I think a lot of people of our generation and perhaps the generation after us, that was their first big novel, what felt like a good novel. But for an introduction to fantasy, I think that we actually had a couple other options when we were younger. I brought up the option of the Bailey School Kids series, a chapter book series where the kids keep looking at adults in their town or in their school and thinking that they're magical creatures. The first one is about how the kids think that their teacher's a vampire, and they keep finding reasons why she is a vampire and also reasons why she's not a vampire. So while that's not explicitly hard fantasy, it is definitely leaning towards that and could intrigue a kid in that case. Similar lines, chapter books like The Great Mouse Detective. You might not think it's a mystery. Yes, it's about a detective, but the protagonists are talking mice. That's fantasy, baby. We got things like Stuart Little and The Borrowers, tiny little books that are about tiny humans that live in the walls, mouse-sized humans. That's also fantasy. Again, it's not high fantasy, but those are fantasy stories. And then, of course, my personal introduction into horror, things like Goosebumps, dummy coming to life for no apparent reason. Like there's monsters and things like that. That's all fantasy. It's all speculative fiction. Those are introductions to fantasy that I had that I really loved. So like I purposefully tried to aim a little bit younger because yes, I read Harry Potter and that was probably my first like big high fantasy one. Although I did just grab Redwall by Brian Jacques because I really loved this series and I was reading it probably concurrently with Harry Potter. This one is also perhaps even more like traditional high fantasy. Again, mice being the protagonist, but animals, talking animals being the protagonists. But still, these are like fantasy books that we also read back then. So I wanted to give a couple other examples that people could take of like what may have actually sparked your love for fantasy. It doesn't necessarily have to always be the most obvious high fantasy book. Could have been something simple like this that spurred you to look for more similar things that got more and more fantastical in nature.
Like I read Harry Potter, but I'm not a huge Potterhead. Sorry. Question two. Question two is, and if you see me looking this way, it's because it is also, it's where my computer is, so it means that's where Michaela's face is because we are obviously video chatting, and it's also where the written question is. So that's what's happening here because I can't remember what one sentence is without reading it. So question two is, if you could become the heroine or hero of a fantasy novel, who would the author be, and what's one trope you'd insist on in the story? I don't know if this is a cop-out, but for like all of the reasons that I absolutely just mentioned, Tamora Pierce would be my author because I know that she, and my trope would be women warrior because I have always like, I wanted to be a knight as a kid because I wanted to swing a sword and save people from dragons and be the hero of the story. And Tamora Pierce was the first person, at least to me, who said, you know, it doesn't have to be the boy who is the knight. You too can be the knight. And I also know that she would have a very complex story, a story that, like I said, grows and learns. And she has now written through some of her characters and shown what they were like as children, what they were like as young adults, and now people with families of their own. And she manages to make like complex, interesting, like their lives are still really awesome. So I know she could take me all the way from like the beginning to the end, and she would have me set. So I trust Tamora Pierce with my life as a woman warrior knight.
Mine is also probably not surprising for people who know me, but I would pick Patrick Rothfuss to write a book where I'm the protagonist. Part of that is because I want somebody who can write well and his prose is beautiful. I have never met anybody else who writes like Patrick Rothfuss. I love it. That's beautiful. I care a little bit too much about that. I know that that doesn't have anything to do with the story, but it's something I care about. The other reason that I think that he would be a good person to write a story for me is that I know that he can write neurodivergent characters well. So if you haven't read his novella, The Slow Regard of Silent Things, I highly recommend it, but this is not a book for everybody. It is very divisive from my understanding, but from everyone I've talked to, anybody who's neurodivergent or who suffers anxiety, depression, something like that, they can see themselves in this character. I also happen to know, because I watch him live stream and I see his charity work, that he is pro-LGBTQIA, pro-trans stuff. So he's not going to take away my non-binary identity, and he would probably actually allow that to flourish, as well as my asexual identity. I think that he would actually be able to do something like that really well. Things that I care about, because when a large portion of fantasy is run by straight white men, it's a little bit dangerous when you're not, you know, they're what they think that they, you get it, all of the queer folks get it. So I think he could do me justice there. Then the trope, obviously I want to go to the university, magic school, come on, magic school, let's do that.
So question 3 is, what is a fantasy that you've read this year that you want more people to read? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Michaela and I are both going to do the same thing here, where we're not going to talk about a book we read this year, like 2021, because it is still very early in 2021. And for me personally, I've talked about recently how it's been hard for me to read fantasy, which used to be my favorite genre. And in the time of COVID, my brain is just not wired to handle a lot of that. So I've read very little fantasy as opposed to normal. And also Michaela had the plague. And I'm very happy that she no longer is, MIA from the channel and my life. So we're going to take something from last year. And mine is Soul Swift by Megan Bannon. I do not have it as a prop because I read the e-arc of it. And it was a book that I read last year, and someone actually just commented on my ARC review and said, "You're like the only person on BookTube that I've seen review this book," which is weird because Megan Bannon has written a couple of books I thought were well received. But Soul Swift is this fascinating YA fantasy that is very philosophical about conception of religion. Not a religion that you would recognize as a fantasy world, but it's two divergent religions that have like a similar origin story, but the way that they interpret them or the way that they've changed them has made their countries enemy. Like, it's really interesting, and you really don't often see that in YA fantasy. And I need more people to read this book because apparently not a lot of people have, and I want to talk about it. The ending especially, just like, I have feelings and I can't spoil it for anyone, so I need you to turn off this video right now, come back to it, it'll be in your history, read Soul Swift, and then come back and talk to me.
I am going to recommend The Deep by Rivers Solomon for this one. I read this at the very end of December, so very almost in this year. It's technically last year, but very almost in this year. It's short. It's a very good example of intergenerational trauma. So if that's something that you hear talked about through BLM discussions or through any sort of discussions where people are talking about how trauma is passed down through the generations, this is a fantasy look at how that might affect somebody. So you get to see sort of the mental effects that that has on somebody. At the baseline, this is a story about black mermaids, the descendants of pregnant slaves who were thrown off of slavers' ships. The babies were granted the ability to breathe underwater, and they turned into mermaids. They developed over time. They found each other, created a community. It is also has a bit of queer relationship stuff. The author is trans, so that's something that, like, if you are a person that likes to read queer literature, if you're a person that likes to read black literature, if you're just someone that wants to understand intergenerational trauma, this is a good one. It's also just a really nice story. Like, it was quite sweet and powerful, so really good one.
So question 4 is a double-parter. Is that a word? It is now. So the first part of it is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre? And then what is a fantasy subgenre you don't read a lot of? And Michaela, bless her, when we were pre-talking this video, was like listing a whole bunch of fantasy subgenres. And I was like, I don't know. Because I feel like I'm pretty equal opportunity. Like, I want to read, what are the characters? What's the world? Like, what's going on? I'll read just about anything. But I think in terms of like a generic subgenre, that's my favorite. It's probably adventure fantasy, because I am a sucker for gotta go save the world, gotta go on a quest, gotta, deliver the ring to Mordor. I don't know, whatever it is. I'm into it, and I like there being some bigger, like, adventure action. I like really, really fast plots, which is probably why the subgenre I read the least of is high fantasy. While I do enjoy a well-built world, there are some high fantasy novels that are just like taking 3 pages to explain the backdrop of the sword that the main character got from their grandfather's cousin's uncle, and the whole myth of the eyes. I have a really short attention span for that kind of thing. I know that some people love it. I wish that I could respect it more. I respect the heck out of authors who can do that well, but I actually fell asleep reading George R.R. Martin's A Dance with Dragons, and unfortunately I was in bed holding the book above my head and I dropped it on my face. So yeah.
If we're talking about me and reading fantasy, the fantasy genre I've read the most of is probably urban fantasy. And I think that stems from my love of magical realism, which I think is like a bridge between literary fiction and fantasy, because obviously magical realism is quite often looped with literature and literary fiction, but it's definitely has more of the speculative elements, so it starts bridging the gap. And again, you go into urban fantasy and it's like, okay, I don't have to learn a whole new world, it's my world, it's just got some fantastic elements in it. Same sort of idea. That's something that I've read the most of, and I think I feel the most comfortable in. It's really easy for me to just go through those. They're often popcorn reads for me. When it comes for the genre that I read the least and the one that I dislike the most, it's probably political fantasy. So I don't know that that's its own subgenre. It's a genre of high fantasy where the focus is very much on political intrigue and the like who has power and how are they going to get power and who's got to kill who, and I just don't care. I super don't care. I don't care who has power and what. It's not interesting for me. So like Gretchen said, she needs a lot of action and adventure, like her characters to be doing stuff. This is a lot of people talking and scheming, and I don't care. I don't care about who has power in your weird land. Whatever. Get over it. No one cares.
So question 5 is, who is one of your auto-buy authors? And I deeply appreciate saying one, because there are definitely authors who, even though I'm not reading fantasy, I would auto-buy more of. But I actually have my most recent book acquisition here, which was an auto-buy, Sarah J. Maas. This is her brand new one, A Court of Silver Flames. And if you don't already know this, I have a tattoo of one of the lines from Throne of Glass, which was her debut, on my shoulder. Sarah is now writing a lot of books, and I will definitely say that I am engaging more and more in discussions about how some of her books are not that good. And in fact, Michaela and I did a Betwixt review of her last newest book, The House of Earth and Blood, the Crescent City book. Its title is one of those things, and I can never remember which one it is. But even though I felt really meh about that book, 100% I'm still going to buy the second one because it's Sarah. She's also the only author I have seen twice in person. I have seen very few authors, like even once, but I have gone out of my way to see her twice in person. Remember when we could do that? Because like, Sarah. So same thing. I don't know how I feel about Nesta, who is the main character of this book. I have not liked her in the last 3 court books that existed, and I'm very in the beginning of this one. So, and also one of our highest watched reviews is me ranting about the 3rd court book. So like, who knows what's gonna happen, but I'm still gonna auto buy her books.
My auto-buy author is Laurel K. Hamilton. This series and her other series, which I don't think she's written in quite a few years, I don't know if that completely ended or if she's just not feeling interested in it, but this series, the Anita Blake series, I've been reading since high school. It is in the high 20s now in that series, and yeah, this is the newest one in that one, Sucker Punch. I have not read this one yet. I think it came out this summer or fall, like it's quite recent. And then the one that she had the year before, I also have not read. So I'm a little bit behind, but I've still been buying them because I've invested so much time and energy into this series, and I do enjoy it. It's not one that I talk about a whole lot on the channel because, again, it's not a series for everybody. I understand the complaints that come from like her writing. Not everybody is going to like what these are. I happen to really enjoy it, and it was part of my formative childhood, I was a teenager, but still childhood years, and yeah, so she's an auto-buy author. I buy all of her books. Doesn't matter what series it's from, I've read them all with the exception of the 2 most recent, so there we go.
So question 6 is, how do you find fantasy recommendations? And it gives us suggestions of YouTube, Goodreads, podcasts, Instagram. I gotta tell you guys, I don't know if these are recommendations per se, but I am a librarian. And while I have a weird relationship with reviews as like a personal reader, as a librarian, you have to read the reviews and you have to be aware of what is coming out, because, you know, only some books will get reviewed, and oftentimes like some of the books that get reviewed are not actually the popular ones that your people are going to want, especially as a children's librarian as I still am. I'm actually buying 5 collections from my library right now, spanning literally every age. So I am just like, I'm, on Twitter reading book news. I'm, Kirkus reviews is one of my favorites. But there's also school library journal, book list, book page, like Ingram itself, which is how my library buys their books. I have to be constantly looking at things. And while one of the few things that I don't buy is either fantasy adult or young adult fantasy, when you're out in the ether and when you follow as many people on like Twitter or something as I do that are all YA people, they come across your feed and I get to go, ooh, it looks pretty. Or, ooh, look who has a new book coming out. It's not infallible. Sometimes I still miss things, but that's like a very, very large portion of my life. So there you go.
I work in a bookstore, so I also am quite on top of what's coming out because I get to see it like when it is being put out on the shelves. I get to see it when it comes in, so that is one way that I find out about books. I just see them, and also just walking by the shelves, I get to see them. I am also someone that like watches YouTube more than Gretchen does, so I definitely get reviews from the community. I hear people talk about stuff and then I'm interested in it more than I may have been when I saw it come into the store or go on the shelves. I follow people on Instagram, so I'll see covers that I find very interesting. I definitely have I don't see it before it comes out quite as often. Like Gretchen is looking at stuff before it's published to buy it so that it's there when it's published. I'm seeing stuff like maybe the week before, 2 weeks before, maybe the day of, or the day before it comes out, but I am still seeing it like right about then. When it comes to like pre-published stuff, like before it's coming out, it's just scrolling through the options on things like NetGalley and Edelweiss, looking at what is being offered. You can sort of see and tell new stuff that's coming out that way, if it's a matter of like you want to look at the new cutting edge stuff. But if it's a matter of like older stuff, looking through the shelves is also a really good way. Like go into a bookstore, just look through the shelves, look at the covers, look at some spines. If you see a blurb by an author you like, see if it's something, they're probably from the same genre or close to the same genre. It might be something worthwhile. Yeah. Just looking at the books themselves is what I spend most of my time doing. That's where I get most of my information, looking at them.
Speaking of NetGalley and Edelweiss, question 7 is what is an upcoming fantasy release that you are excited for? And so I also use NetGalley and Edelweiss, more Edelweiss than NetGalley. And I believe it was Edelweiss where it popped up that Victoria Aveyard, who wrote the Red Queen series, has a new book coming out on May 4th called Realm Breaker. And when Red Queen first came out, people were like, you've got to read this, you've got to read this, you've got to read this. And I was like, because you keep telling me to read it, I'm not gonna. And then I read it, and it was one of the more refreshing fantasy reads that I had read at that time. And at that time I was reading a lot of it. So for me to say that, I was like, ho, 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 this is good. And I actually met her and had books signed by her when she released, it's not technically one of the Red Queen books, but it's the last one she released. It is a series of short stories. And so I have that signed by her. It's very cool. And so she's releasing this new book called Realm Breaker, which seems very similar in vibe to the Red Queen series, but is not related to it. And I am very excited for her to be doing something new and something, where she's learned all the lessons of her first 5-book series. And Edelweiss gave me an arc. I'm gonna try so hard to review it for you guys. I'm struggling with fantasy, and this is over 500 pages, but I'm gonna try because I'm excited.
So when we saw this question, we were looking for our answers. I picked like 2 or 3 books and then looked it up, and they came out in the last month or 2. So apparently I'm not super on top. I had the plague, guys. I'm not I haven't been on top of things like I should be. So I dug a little bit deeper. I'm going to talk about The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nevo, which I've heard a bunch of YouTubers talk about as being on their most anticipated book. So obviously it's getting publicity. It's getting buzz, chatter. the like tagline that people are saying is it's the Great Gatsby but with magic and queer, which is like really okay. All right, I'm into it. 1920s Vietnamese American girl who's trying to make it in golf. I think she's like a very good golfer, and she's obviously golf is a sport that is predominantly participated in by upper class society. So again, this sort of 1920s white upper class society, and she's trying to like learn about stuff and get in with the people there, the community there. But she also has a magic where she can like enchant paper to do stuff, which is interesting. So yeah, it's like a Gatsby-esque 1920s queer apparently story. So yeah, I'm into it. I'm here for the LGBTQIA. I got this. This will be great. High hopes.
So question 8 is about what is a common misconception of fantasy that you would like to lay to rest. Since you may have noticed, I specifically focus my reading on YA fantasy. This is slightly tilted towards that particular kind of fantasy, although I think that it applies to fantasy in general. And so there's this idea that, particularly in YA fantasy, that fantasy isn't a literary genre. So you get that in fantasy, like in general. But for YA fantasy, I've definitely heard people say that fantasy already isn't literary, but people who can't do like the strong world building that's in adult fantasy write YA fantasy, where they can be lazy. There's this conception that YA fantasy is lazy, and I hate it, and it is wrong. It is wrong. There are so many excellent authors who write YA fantasy, and there are even people who write adult fantasy that also write YA, like Brandon Sanderson, for example. It's not true. Yes, there are lazy YA fantasy books. There are also lazy adult fantasy books, and there are lazy adult literary fiction books. And what I find lazy, you might find great, and what you find lazy, I might find great. Reading is all about your personal opinions, and to a certain extent, many of those can be combinable. There are definitely some things that just make a book really, really bad that we can all agree on. And bad world building can be one of those things, but YA fantasy is not a place where lazy world builders go. That is wrong, it is incorrect, and there are some times when I find the world building in YA better than in adult, because they take the details that you absolutely need to know, and then they move on with the story. Nobody is describing this backstory of somebody's sword for 7 pages. I don't need it. It's fine. I'm angry now, so Michaela can talk.
She's angry. I get it. I'm going to talk about that thing that she said at the beginning where people feel like fantasy isn't literary, or it isn't worth literary merit. That's true of a lot of genres, not just fantasy, but I feel like a lot of people feel like if you read fantasy, you're quite juvenile, like you can't read hard literary fiction, and as someone who reads both, obviously that's not true. Sometimes people, because of the, I think, sort of inherent escapist nature in fantasy literature, because it's not set in our reality, it gets this feeling like you can't deal with reality, when honestly a fantasy is just a way to like think about and deal with this exact same things that are going on in reality. Same with science fiction. They're both just dealing with whatever reality is, and doing it in a different way, and often a way that takes much more work than it does to do literary fiction. They might say there's lazy writing in fantasy. I would argue super against that. Go read some Patrick Rothfuss. That's not lazy. He's very particular with his words. It is almost poetry sometimes. People, feel like it doesn't handle hard issues. Super not true. A lot of fantasy covers a lot of hard issues like genocide, race, stuff with race. It's just another way for us to look through our world in a different lens. So yeah, I don't think people should treat it as less than or as juvenile when it's doing the exact same thing. All of it is literature. All of it is valid. All of it is all of us trying to understand our reality and understand each other a little bit better. So, yeah.
So question 9 is a long one, so I'm gonna like lean for a second. If someone had never read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that came to mind as a place to start, what would those recommendations be? And as someone, and Michaela has the same issue as a bookseller, but as someone who's also a librarian and has to deal with this question on a daily basis, this is not a detailed enough question. Like, I would never actually answer this question as it stands in real life because, like I was just saying, and by the way, did you like how Michaela and I's answers built off each other? That was planned. This is planned, believe it or not, sometimes. But anyway, because I would have to ask, like, okay, so if you've never read a fantasy before, like, what is it that you like about the other books that you have read? Because like Michaela was saying, fantasy books cover everything that other genres cover, just in a fantastical way. And, you know, is it characters? Is it world building? I could go on. And so I really just kind of leaned on the first 3 books that came to mind. And part of that was, you know, we're coming to the end of this tag. So the first book that I would recommend, if someone came up and they said, well, I want, and these are going to be all YA fantasy, because again, that's my niche, and Michaela will cover the actual fantasy bits. So for YA fantasy, if someone came to me and they said, hey, I want a YA book that deals with some kind of philosophical issue, because maybe you like literary fantasy because it's philosophical and it makes you think about big world concepts, then I would absolutely recommend Soul Swift by Megan Bannon for reasons that I have already said. There are certainly plenty of other YA books that could do that, but it's the first one that came to mind thinking about that question. That's what I got for you. If you came to me and you said, I want a fantasy book that has very excellent world building and, you know, is a traditional fantasy book, I would 100% have to say Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, because this is kind of one of my auto defaults. And also because I have a line from this book tattooed on my shoulder, I can scare people into reading it because they're like, oh God, she tattooed it on herself. Which was a very effective strategy for me when I was also a bookseller, just saying. Because I believe that the world building in this book is exceptionally strong. The later bits in the series I have things about, but check out my reviews. But this book in particular is an excellent place to start. And then if someone came to me and they said, okay, either something about strong characters, they wanted romance, and they wanted, also I was thinking about a lot of people really enter fantasy through fairy tales and retellings. So trying to cover a couple of those bases, I would 100% recommend Renee Ahdiah's The Wrath and the Dawn. This is a retelling of Shahrazad and the 1001 Nights story. It is a duology, so unlike things, I should mention Soul Swift is a standalone, but Throne of Glass is I believe it's 7-book series. This is only a duology, so maybe you want something that's more than 1 book, but you don't want to make a huge investment. I feel like The Wrath and the Dawn covers a lot of those bases. And it's also just like all of these are incredible, well-written, wonderful stories. So I don't like this question, but I tried to cover as many bases on like off the top of my head as possible. Ask me it again in the comments with a few more like parameters, and I will give you like 3 new books probably every single time. There's so many good books.
Like Gretchen said, as a bookseller, if somebody asked me this question, I would respond to it with questions like, what did you like in other books? What are your other favorite books? I'll try and find something that has those elements in it. So the way that I went about picking books for this was that I treated this like my younger self. I went like, what would me 5 years ago, because I made a video, might even be 7 years ago now. I made a video where I talked about how I like hated fantasy. Like I have this love-hate relationship where some of them I really love and some of them I really hate. So these were some books that like I now would turn back to that person and say, hey, here are the things that you like that will help you get through it. And then also just some tips on finding books in a genre if it's not something that you've explored before. So my first recommendation, Every Heart a Dory by Shannon McGuire. It's a novella, it's tiny, so if you look for shorter things, it's a lot less intimidating than those big chunky books. So while I could say, yes, read Patrick Rothfuss, read Brandon Sanderson, all of their books are huge. So if you haven't read any fantasy before, picking up something that size feels exhausting and daunting. So yes, novella. This one is also an award winner. It won the Hugo and the Nebula. Looking for award winners, you're probably going to be finding books that at least generally are considered the cream of the crop of books. I really love this one. It has ace rep and own voices because Shannon McGuire identifies as demisexual. There's some queer characters, some gender nonconforming characters in here, trans characters. So if that's, again, I'm me, so I'm going to talk about the queer literature. This is definitely something to pick up, but also think about that. Like the size of the book and award winners is definitely something to think about when you're entering into a genre that you may not know. I highly recommend it. It's great. The whole series is great. I'll put that behind me. The second thing that I picked was short story collection. This is Wicked Wonders by Ellen Klages. I talked about it briefly last year. This is also a queer author, and there's elements of queerness within some of the stories, not all of the stories. This is also not hard fantasy. This is more of one of those like magical realism type things where like it's pretty much our society, but then you go into like another world, so it has that element where you aren't as overwhelmed by the fantasy elements. It's just sort of starting to introduce them to you. There's also some science fiction stuff in here, so it's not all fantasy, but I would highly recommend this. I first heard about this author from LeVar Burton's podcast, LeVar Burton Reads, where he reads speculative fiction short stories. So if you are looking for short stories with speculative fiction, go to his podcast and listen to some. You will more than likely find authors that you connect with, just because he reads such a large amount, and now it's been going for several years. That's a good resource to you as well if you are not a fantasy person. Short stories, always a good option. If you can find one that's not just one author, because obviously one author is going to focus very heavily on that. Their themes, their own interests. If you can find a compendium, like a best of like whatever, or of a lot of different authors, that's also highly recommended. I think I have Rogues somewhere behind me, which was collected by George R.R. Martin, also an option. But yeah, short stories, always helpful when introducing yourself to a genre. And the last one, Alatsue by Darcy Little Badger. I read this one last year. This one is what I would consider urban fantasy, so that genre that I really enjoyed. It's also YA. I find that YA is a little bit less bogged down in that high fantasy stuff. So they tend to be more action-packed and have a better pacing than adult fantasy may, and I find that that might help people feel like they've really enjoyed the book because they are continuing to read and getting into it. So all of Gretchen's recommendations are going to probably have that same sort of thing where you feel like you can keep reading it and enjoying it and consuming it because you're not getting bored. This is another one. I, again, personally really enjoy urban fantasy. I think that it's a really great way to get into fantasy because, again, you don't have to learn about this whole new world with all of these different rules. It's our world, but with magic in it. This little girl is able to raise ghosts of animals. She's indigenous, as is the author. It's an own voices story in that case. She's asexual, another queer book recommendation as someone who is ace. Again, yes, I love that. This is her cousin dies, I believe. In his final breath, before he fully passes over, he tells her that he was murdered, and he doesn't think that they're going to call it a murder and that she needs to go and figure it out. So she goes there, tries to figure out what's going on in this town that he was near and who did it, and there's other things going on. There's vampires in the world. There's some, like, Irish Celtic magic stuff in there as well. So yes, indigenous author, great indigenous story, representation, queer story, love it. That's my recommendation too. If you try YA, it's not worse than adult fantasy, and it's not better than adult fantasy necessarily either. It's just different, and I find that YA stories tend to have better pacing. Not always, but tend to have better pacing than adult fantasy does.
So there is one last question for this tag, and it is, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? And I know this is not the first time that we have talked about this content creator on our channel, but I cannot say enough about Jess Owens. She is a YouTube booktuber who does fantasy content and sometimes like bakes also while she does it and other really fun stuff. But she is also the creator of something that comes out almost every Tuesday and sometimes even more than just once a week, called Book Community. And it's something where she makes people aware of either what's going on book Twitter, because I feel like often my question is, what is going on book Twitter now? And she kind of brings you through that, or she talks about different issues that have come up with books or authors or agents was a really good recent one, or just in publishing in general, because publishing is just kind of a big dumpster fire sometimes, particularly if you're looking out for the interests of people of color or just diverse persons in general. Or they're publishing problematic things. And as someone whose job it is to choose the correct books to purchase for my library, I want to A, be giving my readers good books, and B, I want to be promoting good authors, and C, I don't want to have bought into something like there was something a couple of weeks ago where a publisher was actually still selling copies of an author's books but wasn't paying them royalties, and I don't want to be near any of this. But as someone who is purchasing 5 collections for my library, I barely have enough time sometimes to read a large number of reviews. I certainly don't have time to look at all of this information, to see all of this stuff that's going on about authors or publishers or books or whatever. And I can watch Book Community on my lunch break and just be like, oh, okay, here's what's going on. And she's also just so good at finding worldwide causes to make people aware of, and puts links in her description. It's just, she is so amazing. So I feel like, this was like fantasy content creator, and obviously her fantasy stuff is amazing, and you could probably just turn on just talking about a paper bag for 20 minutes and I'd watch it. But it's been such a good find, and I have to thank Michaela for turning me onto it, because it's just so good and I love it, and you should all go follow her right now. If not for her, then also for her puppy Nigel, who is so cute. So cute.
So, slightly embarrassed with mine. I just found Murphy. She's quite large in the fantasy community, and I don't know how I missed her. Because she's done stuff with other content creators that I watch. I don't know if my head was in the sand, what was going on, but she is a booktuber here who is also a voice actor that reads audiobooks, but she is a huge fantasy person and does all of these really great sessions where she'll read like whole series and talk about how the series was as a whole. And she's gone back and read like classic series as well that most fantasy readers have had a base in, that I don't necessarily, because I read so widely. I miss out on things that are quite popular years ago. Especially when we do booktube, we tend to focus so much on the new hot thing that we tend not to go back and look at like the quote-unquote classics or the quote-unquote canon. And she's doing that, and I really appreciate that as someone who doesn't necessarily have time to read every single book. And most people who are just like, I'm gonna gush about the Wheel of Time series and mention it every once in a while because I know how great the Wheel of Time series is, but never say actually anything meaningful, when you can go to a channel and see somebody who's like, no, hey, let me break down why this series is so influential, and why everybody loves it, and or some of the problematic things, because we all have seen it happen where everybody loves it and then a couple years later somebody's like, hey, this element was actually kind of problematic, let's talk about that. Things like that. So yeah, if you haven't seen Murphy, go find Murphy. I don't know how you wouldn't have seen her. I don't know how I missed her, but if you were in the same weird time warp that I was and we didn't get into her, I link her down below as well. Highly recommended. Go find her.
All right, guys, you have made it to the end of what is probably a rather long video, but that is what happens when we make content together. It has been so long because Michaela has been fighting off the plague, the literal plague death. And I am so happy that she is back. I'm sure you are super sick and tired of seeing just my face. That is not what you come to Betwixt the books for. There has to be something to be betwixt. So super happy that she is here. Super happy to have had this conversation with you. We will have links in the description for like Jess and Murphy, and we will also link up above to any of the reviews that we mentioned. Like Michaela just said, we have some of these videos are like 7 years old. Yeehaw! It's been a really, really, really long time on this little channel of ours, and thanks for surviving the plague. That was real cool. So hope that you guys have enjoyed this, and we will be back with more Betwixt content. Bye guys!